is focused on the client as the entity. So when I log into Caseworthy and I am on the Case Management tab, which is easily identifiable because the little toolbox will be the lighter colored blue. When I log in there, it's going to have a record of an individual, and that individual will be the person who I will be interacting with. That's who I'm recording the information on, and that's whose record I'm going to continue to interact with over time. So this corner identifies that person and displays the client ID. This little drop down here on the person would indicate the number of household members and also identify the relationship to head of household pretty clearly. Once we drop that down and we see multiple members of the household, you can toggle between those members of the household just by clicking on another household member, and it will load that household member's record at the top. So this is now the record that I'm interacting with. I'm going to switch back to the HOH because we'll get some better stuff there. Also here, we include, in this dropdown, we include just some quick links. They are just menu links that will take the user to the demographics form for this specific user or to the case note summary form for this specific user. We'll look at those a little more closely here in a few minutes, but I just wanted to point out that that is there, that we basically have these quick links to some pretty commonly used forms and functionalities. Hovering over the little heart, we'll see the birth date for the individual. We will see, hovering over the little person, the gender that is identified on the client demographics form. And we will also see, hovering over this, some options that are somewhat configurable, but in this case, the baseline version is going to show you the client ID, which is maybe a little redundant because we're already showing it to you there, but it is there. The family name, which is automatically generated by the system when you create a client record and a new family, and it is automatically written as or recorded as last name, comma, first name dash date of birth of whoever is the head of household. Then we also have the a race identifier that shows you the race name at this point. It's just indicating that this client is recorded as multiracial. So that's what's up in the top left-hand corner. Moving down, the left-hand navigation menu are all the menu links to various pieces of functionality that we're going to spend some time talking about today as we move through, and particularly after probably we finish up the workflow. We'll kind of move back through some of those things. But at the very top of that in 7.2, there is a favorites section. So this is equivalent to something like bookmarks in your browser. So Caseworthy is a secure site, and part of the security of the site is that the URL is static. In other words, once I log into Caseworthy, it doesn't matter where I click, which form I access, which client record I access, which of these tabs I open, or any of those other things, the URL in my address bar of my browser always stays exactly the same. Therefore, interacting with your browser in a way that would change or affect the information that is stored within the address bar will cause some perhaps unexpected behavior. So for instance, if you hit the back button, you're navigating through Caseworthy and you go to 3 or 4 different forms and you decide you want to go backwards, that's going to take you out of Caseworthy. It's going to log you out of Caseworthy, and you're going to have to log back in. Okay. If you click the refresh button, same thing's going to happen, which probably makes more sense. But if you favorited a page, a specific page within Caseworthy or a dashboard in your browser, and you clicked on that while you were logged into the application, it would just take you back to the login screen because all of this is static. So we try to have some way to help utilize tools like that you might be familiar with because of your browser. We try to find some ways to help you utilize those kinds of practices within Caseworthy. So one way we do that is by, we've added a favorites bar. So if you click on the favorites bar, you'll see any favorites that you currently have, which I just currently have one that takes you to this dashboard that we're already on. And they'll all show up basically here in a menu that's similar to what you'll see when you use the navigation menus further on. So the more of these you have, the more you'll see. But currently I just have the one and it takes you here. If I click on the little pencil here then I can edit my favorite pages. I can move them up and down in the list using the option on the left. I could change the label. I could delete it altogether, et cetera, et cetera. But that's how that's going to work. I believe if you don't have any favorites set, then the favorites menu doesn't show up. So if you happen to be playing along at home and you're looking at your screen and you're saying, well, I don't see any favorites, what's he talking about? It may be because you don't have any favorites set yet. The way that favorites are set and added, while we're kind of talking about that functionality and the general framework of Caseworthy, is under the teardrop on basically any form or dashboard that you might interact with within Caseworthy. You'll see several options. Most of them are not applicable at this point, but this favorite page allows you to create that favorite. So you give it a name when you click on it, and you hit save, and now you'll have the favorites bar. Okay. So moving then across sort of the top and that way, a similar piece of functionality that is going to replicate or imitate in some ways basic browser functionality that you might be used to is the breadcrumbs. These breadcrumbs are represented by the three little dots, the ellipsis, next to the title of whatever page or dashboard you're currently viewing, which is what shows up here. Once you're within a single tab and you have navigated from one place to another, you can navigate backwards for a grand total. I think it's about 10 clicks currently. So if you click on these little, on the ellipsis on the breadcrumbs, it'll show you the places that you have been that you could navigate backwards to. And if you click on that, it takes you backwards. Once you get all the way back to the earliest page to which you have navigated, the breadcrumbs go away. In other words, Caseworthy utilizes the breadcrumbs to indicate or to replicate something of a back button, but there is no equivalent forward button. Once you have moved backwards, we don't currently have an option for you to select something and then move forward in a different, in the opposite direction, so to speak. But we do have the breadcrumbs. Right above where the breadcrumbs or the form or dashboard display shows up, there are three horizontal lines. These three horizontal lines will collapse the left-hand navigation menu, giving you more room to view the workspace. So the workspace then is anything that's in this grayish area. Sometimes it's more of a white, but this is where dashboards will be that you can interact with or that will display data. This is where forms will load and render so that you can enter data or view data that exists within the database. This is where you're going to do a lot of what you do outside of just navigating through the system. Okay, so if I click on those three horizontal bars again, then I get my left-hand navigation menu back. The Case Management tab, as I mentioned, is already indicated here as being the default tab for your roles within your database currently. And that is, again, the one that is filtered by the entity, or that is a client, the person who we are providing services to and recording information about actively at this time. The next one over, which is three little people, is the organization tab. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on the organization tab today unless we end up having some extra time. But in this case, the entity or the noun that is being focused on at this level is actually the agency with which, by default, your user is currently associated. And so the entity name shows up here. We don't have any other information that's currently being displayed about the information in the organization tab, but we do have an entity name that is referenced up top, which again lets us know what is all this information about. So when I look at the providers, for instance, I'm looking at the providers that are tied with my organization. Okay, so when we talk about the org tab, what that is used for most regularly within an HMIS would be this ability to track both referrals and resources and usages, such as shelter bed nights associated with a specific provider or a service providing location that belong to a single organization. So that's really the biggest gist of what we're doing here on this tab, but this is the org tab, and since you have access to it, I want to spend a little time introducing it. The last one is the administration tab. The administration tab is technically tied to the org of the current user, but it is also sort of not tied to anything specifically. We don't actually reference that all that often, and instead at this point is used for setting up the system, although we've taken away most of the major access to those forms in this role, and then looking at things that go sort of beyond any single org, which has to do with primarily reporting and codes and categories. So those would be like lookup lists. So there are a lot of places within the system where you might navigate and see that a list is already populated by some values, and that may be happening within codes and categories. So that's primarily what we're doing here. I'm going to go back to the case management tab because that's where we're going to focus the bulk of our energy, especially towards the beginning of the call. And I'll keep talking about what's over on this side. So on the far right side of the application, when you've logged in, you'll see information about the user. Okay, so anytime that I'm within the application of Caseworthy, I'm actually looking at and referencing two different entity IDs at the same time, two different nouns, okay? One of them is the client that I've been talking about. This is the person about who we are writing data, right? We're writing data on behalf of this person, or recording transactions that occurred and benefited this person, or writing case notes about the time, the time we spent with this person, those kinds of things. But on the other side, what we're essentially looking at is should be you. If it's not you, then you probably need to get a hold of someone at your agency who you can talk to, because there may be a problem, but it should be you most of the time. But more importantly than just being you, this is also, well, maybe not more importantly than just being you, because you're probably pretty important. But in terms of the functionality of Caseworthy, it is the individual who is recording the data, okay? So it is the created by user, okay? Or if you're updating a data element, piece of data that already exists, then it would be the last modified by user, okay? If you're one of those really dedicated people who likes to read HUD's data dictionary like I do for whatever reason, then you know that those are actually both HUD required data elements for almost every single, well, for every single program. For an HMIS software in general, we have to report on who wrote this record or who changed this record. And so when you're logged in as yourself, just know, because your name displays up here, we are keeping track of that all throughout the system, okay? Underneath that, we do display your role. So if I click on this dropdown, we'll see some more information, but the role, which is the bottom one of these and the one that displays here, is how we configure Caseworthy to be different for different users. So Caseworthy is a role-based application, which means we work with system administrators to define who should see what, and then we create new roles that will allow users to see those things. We assign those roles to specific users. Sometimes they just have one, sometimes they have multiple. And then when they log into the system, their current view is filtered by the lens of whatever this role is, okay? At the top of this dropdown, you see the name of the organization that the user is associated with. Organizations within Caseworthy are sort of the largest category that exists. We put the organization ID on almost every piece of data throughout, every transaction, every noun, all the way throughout the system, so that we can determine who actually owns a specific record tied to a client, so that we can report by agency within the system. We also utilize that functionality to control how data is shared between users who are associated with various orgs. So in other words, to make sure that users don't see things they're not supposed to see, or they do see things they are supposed to see, even if those things are created by or belong to another organization. We use that as well. The provider for a user could be one provider, or it could be multiple providers. We use this in association with an organization when they have more than one, in particular, more than one place from which services are provided. So in other words, a single agency within your community might have 2 or 3 offices, okay? Sometimes I've had folks that, customers that have one organization and they have one service providing location, but they have different departments. They may do that. They may, instead of creating them as different service providing locations, they may record the departments as different providers. It can be kind of broken up however that works best for you, but it is sort of a more nuanced definition of where the client is receiving services. So that becomes important for enrollments and for services to a certain extent, but you can see it here. If you have access to more than one provider, you may be able to change it there. And again, if you have access to more than one role, you can switch roles on the fly while you're logged into the database here. Most of you probably don't have access to the role app builder, though some of you might. That is the tool, the link to the tool that we utilize in order to customize the roles, and some other basic features about the utilization of the application itself. And then at the very bottom is the logout button. So that's how a user actively logs themselves out. We do have also, because in part HUD requires it, but also because it's good practice, auto logout policies that will log you out after a certain amount of time with no activity. So that's the general framework of Caseworthy. Again, just kind of wanted to remind you all of that before we launch into the midst of the workflow and talk about the specific forms and data elements that we'll be collecting in your HMIS workflow. Do you have any questions up to this point before I launch into that long speech? It's eerily quiet. That's all right. Okay, so let's talk about the HMIS intake. So on the left-hand navigation bar within your database, once you're logged in, we have the favorites link, which we already talked about. The next form down is the Find Client form. So I'm going to click on that really quickly and just show you how this works. So in Caseworthy, we have 3 different types of forms. The 3 different types of forms allow you to do different things based on their type and based on your purpose. Some forms will have search buttons in this middle blue bar over on this side, and those are called search forms. What that means is this form will allow you to look up data that is already recorded within your database so that it can be utilized and referenced for a specific purpose. In this case, the Find Client form allows me to search the database for any client record that might exist that matches my search parameters. So if I type in last name and search, then I see every client who matches that record. There's some things I want to emphasize about search forms to help provide some clarification, particularly about this one. So this ended up being a good example. Search forms may be constituted of searches that include multiple data elements for, in this case, the client, that could potentially actually even cause duplication of records. So for example, in this case, I know for a fact that the search form looks at not only the client's information, such as their name, date of birth, et cetera, it also looks at the family information for the client that is currently accurate. So you may notice that my first 4 rows of search all find an individual whose name is baby test. Okay, so the first 2 columns on my search are showing me the client's last name and the client's first name. The third one is showing me the entity name. Entity name may sometimes be different than client first name and last name, and that is because in Caseworthy on this particular form, we're also going to show you if the client has any aliases. So if someone has recorded an alias for this client within the system, that alias might show up in the client first name column, but the entity name will be the same for the client across the board. Entity name is something that gets written when the client record is created, and it's not something that we update. We update the client.first name and the client.last name, and then we just reference the entity name. Part of the reason for that is to make sure that the same person who has an alias is identifiable pretty clearly. The next column over is going to show you the social security number for that individual, which is another data element that can be helpful for ensuring that you are working with the same client and not creating duplicated records. The next column over is going to show you the client's date of birth as recorded within the system. If for whatever reason the client only puts in part of a birthday, then this may fill in some of the other parts in ways that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate. But in Caseworthy and for HUD's requirements, a date of birth is required to be in a date format, which means it has to have a month, a day, and a year. So in those cases where the client may only give us the month and year, then we fill in the day with the first date of that month. Okay. If the client just puts in the age, if the user just puts in the age of the client, then it will default to January 1st of whatever year makes them that age. We focus a lot on date of birth rather than client age because age changes over time, and date of birth generally does not. The next column over is relation to head of household. Okay, and then family name. So for my example, where they're all, the first few rows are all showing baby test, this is where you might get some duplication in your search results based on the way the data is put together. Clients could belong to more than one family within Caseworthy, either at a time or over time, and doing so might result in more than one result on this search where you're asking to see the relation to HOH and the family name. In other words, if a client has more than one family and more than one relationship to head of household, they will show up more than once so that you can see all the possible variations of the data that you're requesting across the board, okay? But you can confirm and verify that it is the same client by looking at the client ID. So in this case, the client ID is 18028 for each of these 4 rows, and that indicates that that is the same client record, no matter how many times it shows up. So by selecting any of those rows to access that client's record, it'll pull up the same client ID. It doesn't matter which of those rows we select, it is always the same client ID. So that information about that client can be entered for that client, regardless of which row you pick. I'm going to go back to the Find Client form and find Greg here. If your search results only yield one answer, in other words, if you search for a client and it is so specific that that you find that client just by virtue of the way that you searched, then it'll automatically load that client record for you rather than showing you the list of the one client and having you select it. Once the client is loaded, then we have the client dashboard, which again has various pieces of information. So in this case, we have some client data that just displays some general information about the client. We have some links. We're going to come back to why these links are here and why they're important very soon. But we can also show a client photo if that's being captured and recorded on the client's record, and certain pieces of assessment data. So this is a finances over time that just shows us assessment data that's been entered for the client regarding to finances. So a variety of things can be displayed on the dashboard at any point, as long as the data is being captured and there is a good way to access that data via a query that will load up onto a dashboard. So all of that said, let's look at the HMIS intake. So the HMIS intake workflow is under the Add Client button. And the Add Client button here is going to inspire us to select one of 3 workflows. You can tell within the menu in Caseworthy that these are workflows because they have the workflow icon to the left of the menu title, which just looks something like a workflow or an org chart, depending on your kind of perspective. Accessing a workflow will open a pop-up, which showed up on this other screen for me. And that pop-up will navigate us through all the required forms in order to complete the steps identified and included within this workflow. Those steps are visible on the left-hand side, and they'll change colors as we work through to make sure we know where we are in the workflow. Now, within a workflow, once you've accessed the workflow, you're going to build upon the record that you are interacting with. Therefore, you can't actually move backwards in a workflow while you're in the midst of the workflow. We'll give you access to all of those data points outside of the workflow, and we're working very, very diligently to try to make sure that that access is easy to get to and easily updated once you complete the workflow. But while we're in the midst of the workflow itself, we cannot complete several forms and then move backwards one or two to change data because we've been sort of building data upon itself. The other thing that's important to note about workflows is that you're not really going to move forward or make progress in the workflow, or in other words, actually save data to the database until you click the Save button. So as I'm here typing information, whatever it is that I might be typing in these fields, this data is not saved and will not be saved until I finish the form and hit Save. So if there are required fields, then we have to be aware that I have to complete all of those required fields and meet the requirements of the form and save the data, which will move me on to the next form in the workflow before I can actually have that data saved to the database. Once I have data saved to the database, we'll talk about here in a second how you can sort of pause a workflow and then come back to it later. But initially, you have to make sure that you have some data saved. Otherwise, you won't be able to come back to it at a later point. Okay. The other thing that's important about this as we think about it is that every form in Caseworthy has buttons at the bottom. Well, not every form, but almost every form. And every form in a workflow absolutely does. Those buttons essentially indicate I am done with this form. And they do one of two things. A blue button will always save data to the database. A gray button will always cancel. It will always just say, hey, I'm done now. I'm not going to continue with this particular form. I don't want to save any data on this form. Okay. In either case, clicking those buttons, with one exception that we'll talk about here in just a few minutes, will take you to whatever is next. Now, because of the nature of some of the data elements that are required within the workflow, sometimes not saving data is not really an option to continue in the workflow. In other words, if I'm on the client demographics form, here, this add new client form within my workflow, and I indicate to the system that I would like to cancel, in other words, not save any client data, I'm not going to be able to do anything else in the workflow because everything else in the workflow is in some way directly related to the client that I'm identifying and or creating a record for on this form. If I don't do that, I can't do it, okay? I can't continue in the workflow. Now, there are forms within the workflow where you can say, I don't want to enter information about this person right now. I'm going to click cancel rather than save, and it will take me to the next form. So just bear in mind and remember that the buttons at the bottom of the workflow forms are intended to take you to whatever is next. And in some cases, that may mean that you're done, okay? So the other thing you can do with the add new client form in the workflow is you can either, create a new client record, which is something that I'll probably do here just for the sake of making sure that my data is clean and consistent, or you can actually identify an existing client record and pull it into your workflow. Doing that will pull in any information that is already recorded on the client's record for you. So if I were, for instance, to type in something maybe more general that might help me identify the client who I would like to pull into the workflow, knowing that I think they exist, or even when I don't know that they exist, it can be helpful to check for duplicates. And once I check for duplicates, I have a couple of options of who I might bring in, right? So it shows me the client's entity name, and it shows me the social security number and their date of birth and any alias they might have, and a family name and a client ID, which is a really useful way of identifying individuals within your database who you may want to identify anonymously or who you may want to ensure is the same client that you're really focused on. And clicking on that row will load the data for that individual for me. So this is all the information that exists for this client's record, and it just pulls it in. Now, when I move through the workflow with this client, that same client ID is going to be passed from form to form to form. So if there is information about that client record recorded in my database already, then that information may display. So in other words, if I pull in an existing client record into my database and they have family members already recorded on their record, when I navigate to the family member form, check all the data is required, yes, and hit save, and we'll come back and work through this with a new client in just a second. It's going to pull in that person's record and any family members they might already have as a part of the workflow already. So when you're interacting with a client record who already exists, workflows can be handy not just to add new data, but to review, to update, to clarify any data that already exists. This is also a means of helping ensure efficiency, right? Because we can pull in old data and not necessarily have to type in the same thing over and over and over again. So I'm actually going to use the workflow to create a new client. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out of this workflow. On the teardrop within a workflow, you have the normal options that you might with a form. In this case, most folks, if you're playing along at home, should see either an Excel or a recycle or the save and exit. You probably won't see this format builder, but a couple of you might. But at the bottom of those workflow options, we have two buttons. One says Save Progress and Close. Now remember that I said that the buttons at the bottom of a form in Caseworthy determine where you will go next and what you will do with the data that exists on the form that you are currently working on. If you hit Save, that data will be saved to the database. And if you click Cancel, then that data will not be saved to the database. In some cases, that may move you forward, and in some cases, that may mean you're done. However, once you've hit Save or Cancel occasionally and moved on to a spot within a workflow, you have the ability to save your progress and exit the workflow. In other words, you could say that you need to come back to this workflow at a later moment in time and pick it up right where you left off. When you pick it up right where you left off, remember that Caseworthy doesn't actually store any of the data in the database until you hit Save. So essentially what you're doing is saying, I am at this form as it appeared when I first loaded it within the workflow this time around. Okay, so if I click Save Progress and Close here now, it'll take me back to the client dashboard for the head of household who I was working on most recently. And if I click back on Add Client and HMIS Intake, it will open up the workflow and it will remind me that I was working on a workflow for a specific individual and I'd spent this amount of time on it. These open workflow instances can compile. In other words, you can have as many of them as you want. And so if you get into the midst of a workflow at any point in the workflow and you realize you need to step away or you don't have enough time to do the data entry or you don't have all the data that you really need, you can save the data that you have stored, come back to the workflow later, and pick it right back up where you left off. You also have two other options here. You can just leave this open and bypass it to create a new workflow, which creates a new instance. Okay, so this is how you can sort of compile them. You look at this and you go, okay, I got this workflow open, but I'm not ready to do it. I'm actually doing a new workflow. You click new workflow, this one stays here as an available option. And then you just move forward into the new workflow with a different client record. Okay. The other option that you have here is to close the workflow instance. This X button will take this workflow instance away altogether. In other words, I won't have it anymore in my list of selectable options. And if I want to complete a workflow with this client in the future, I'll have to go back and load a fresh intake workflow, find the client in the demographics form using the check for duplicates feature, load that client record, and continue to proceed through the workflow as if I hadn't been doing it before. Okay, so here you can either select a row, which will load the workflow where you were at most recently, bypass this open workflow instance to create a new workflow, or close this workflow to remove it from your list of open workflow options. In this case, I'm going to select this one just as a way of demonstrating how this works. So if I click on this row, just anywhere on this row, it will take me back to where I was within that workflow. So I had saved on the demographics form and I was viewing the family member form, and it allowed me to come right back to where I was. Okay, that again will work at any point within a workflow. As I mentioned, the save and cancel buttons show you whether or not data is being saved and stored or whether or not you're just indicating you're done with the form. And in some cases, it is possible to move forward within a workflow without saving data. In other words, it is possible to hit the cancel button and to also move on in a workflow without saying that you're done with it. The family member form is a really good example of that because not everybody has family members to be added into the system. And so when I review the family members, if it's a single individual or if all the individuals are already there, you could technically hit save, but also if you hit cancel, it will take you to the next form in the workflow. Okay, I'm not sure that I can actually enroll this client, and I want to talk about creating a brand new client and work through all of those with you together. But I wanted to also introduce sort of the structure of the workflow. So in this case, I'm going to click on that teardrop, and I'm going to click this X button, and I'm actually going to exit this workflow altogether so I can start a new one fresh. You may or may not want to use this feature very often. I want to indicate that because some folks think that if they close the workflow, they can come back to it. If you click the X, that workflow instance is gone. None of the data is gone. Anything that is saved and was saved to the database using the blue save button can be accessed again. It is stored in the database itself and is completely referenceable and reportable. Really what we're discussing at this point is the workflow instance. In other words, this specific progression through all of the forms listed on this left-hand side. And so closing this will end that. So if you're trying to make sure you can come back to an exact spot within the workflow so you can finish the data entry very, very quickly and very, very easily, then this X button is not necessarily something you want to think about. If you get into this workflow and realize for some reason that you're in it by mistake, or that you loaded the wrong client record, or that you really, really, really do just need to be done with it for whatever reason, then you're going to click on that X. Once I do that again, it loads the client record of the individual within the workflow I was most recently working with. And now I can do an add new and focus on the HMIS intake. Okay. When I am creating a new client again, or when I am looking for an existing client using the demographics form, I like to make sure that my searches are relatively open-ended so that I can guarantee I'm not searching for, or I'm not going to create a duplicate client. So in this case, I might just put in the first initial of the first and last name before I check for duplicates. And when I check for duplicates, I see all of these individuals. Okay. If none of these individuals are the individual with whom I am working, and I need to actually create a new client record instead of pulling in an existing client record, then I click on this button at the bottom, this blue button that says this is a new client. That gets rid of the check for duplicates and meets the requirement of that on the form, and allows me then to do the data entry. So I'm going to do another Cami because I'm not that creative. Anything that has a star by it means that it is a required field and that it has to be filled out for in order for you to move on from the form. Certain elements about an individual are required by HUD, but HUD also allows the specific client to choose not to provide that information, or to allow you to indicate that it, for whatever reason, was not collected, they didn't know, et cetera, et cetera. So date of birth is one of those, and so is social security number. So even though date of birth is a required field, there is a drop-down menu to the right of it that allows you to choose options other than a full date of birth, or even a partial date of birth, or even an age. All of these options are available here so that you could indicate that, for instance, the data was not collected. If you indicate the data is not collected, the field gets grayed out, becomes read-only, okay, or display only, and the requirement for this field is satisfied. So if I saved this and looked at all the error messages that come up, date of birth is not one of them, okay? If I put in the full date of birth, it's going to be in a format similar to this, where it's going to ask for the month, the day, and the year. If I change these options to partial month and year, then as I mentioned, the first is going to populate in automatically, and then I'll enter the rest of the data. If I say partial day and year, then the month will default to January, and the rest of the data will be entered manually. And if I say I'm going to put in the age, then I just put in a number that is the age, and the database recognizes that age in this formula, which is stored to the database for HUD compliance purposes, and in order to make sure that the data is of the same standard and therefore quality. This date, this birth date, actually gets recorded as January 1st of 2001 in this case, or whatever year it is that makes that person currently that age. Social Security has similar kind of options where we have full, we either have approximate or partial. We have client doesn't know, client refused, data not collected, all things you're probably familiar with. The partial just allows you to basically input whichever parts of it they might have given you. Based on what you do have. So you just overwrite the X's and then it'll store X's and then the numbers to make sure that the number or the data is of good quality. Okay, if the client is deceased, you're probably not going to identify this during the intake workflow, but at a certain point later in the future, we do have a date for that to be captured. The gender options are those required by HUD. Citizenship status is not required, but we have it on the form. Primary language, which we default. Veteran status, this field will only show up if the client is either identified as over 18 years old or they do not provide an age. In other words, the data is not collected, client refused, et cetera, et cetera. And in those cases, then the veteran status question is also required because they may be older than 18. Race is a multi-select based on the options that HUD requires. Again, client doesn't know and client refused are options. The race is actually stored in two places. It is stored in as a multi-select so that each value selected will be recorded specifically on the client's record. And it is also recorded in a singular spot on the client table so that if the individual has more than one race selected, then it is identified simply as multiracial. Ethnicity is required. In Caseworthy, we do require an address to be tied to a client record. This has just been something that's proven too valuable in too many different ways, although it's not necessarily HUD required. And it does sometimes present some interesting challenges for folks that are working with individuals who are homeless. So we have some ways to work through that. But in general, the address field is just a text box, okay? So it technically can hold any value that you want. So that could be some kind of actual address, or it can be some sort of description that you might want to indicate based on the individual's status. The zip code is a lookup. Which means if I click in this white space or if I click on this magnifying glass, then I will be taken to another form. And within that form, I have options to search for zip codes. We can either search by the zip code itself, the city, the state, or the county. Zip code tends to be one of the easier ones, and I tend to use this one. So if I search on that form and I find only one result, similar to my Find Client form, if I find only one result, for my zip code, it loads all the information in for me automatically. So it's going to map in the county, the city, the state, and the country. And then we're going to note the verify address is also required. Okay. So in this case, given that I have not put in a real address, but I have indicated the city, state, and county, that could be really handy in terms of knowing generally where they are, even if you don't have a specific address. But when you go to verify that address, and get the pop-up, which is a result of an API with Google Maps, you probably will not see the actual address that you provided. The API will take the data you provided as the address information and try to find the closest match. It may include multiple rows of possible data elements here. And if it does, the way that you select the appropriate address is just by clicking on it. Note that my icon is now, my pointer is now a little hand, which means this is a link that I can select. And if I click on it, it's going to load in the latitude and longitude and update my address information to be more accurate to what it is that I indicated and selected. We do store latitude and longitude up to 7 digits after the decimal, which is enormously precise. Okay. Latitude and longitude to 2 digits after the decimal can be things that are across the street from each other sometimes. Latitude and longitude to 7 digits is pretty precise and shouldn't not be confused with any other address within the system. So that's one of the reasons that we do it, is for that lat and longitude, which becomes really helpful for validating that clients were not served twice at the same location, for making sure that we're aware of which providers are actually closest to the client so that they can receive the services that they need in a place that is close to them. a whole bunch of other different functionality. Now, if the address that you entered is not here, or the person does not actually have an address, then you can bypass adding this information to the client's record by simply clicking on Make Verify Address Not Mandatory. And doing so satisfies the requirement of this form, while also allowing you to leave the data entry however you would prefer. There is no lat and longitude for that because we didn't pick a latitude and longitude to load in. So there may be some places where the advantages of that functionality is not fully utilized, but it is an option for those cases where you don't have an actual address for the individual. So it can be very, very handy, very, very useful. The other option, if you don't want to capture a specific city or state or country, is to enter a zip code of 00000. I don't know if I said that 4 or 5 times, but I typed it 5 times. And that gives you a county, city, and state that is acceptable to meet the requirements of the database, but does not actually associate with anything specifically. Okay. Contact information on this field is not required, but can be collected. You can identify whether or not their cell phone is primary, secondary, or tertiary. The system does have a validation rule on this form that requires you to have basically one of each. In other words, you can't say both of these are primary. And we sometimes reference whichever one is marked primary as the phone number you should contact them at. The email address and confirm email address, this is a single data field within the database, and so you have to enter the same email address twice to ensure that you actually have captured it, similar to many other web forms. Other information at the bottom. Sharing or restriction is something we're going to see a lot throughout the system, and it has essentially 2 options. You can indicate that a record should be shared or that a record should not be shared. A record that is set to shared means that it is shared in accordance with whatever rules for data sharing were set up at the database level. In other words, if I work at an agency and I only share my data with 2 other agencies who are also utilizing the same database, if I say shared, then only those 2 other organizations are going to see that information because the system will have been configured so that my data sharing requirements are already included and honored across the board. If I work at that agency and I share with 2 other agencies and I change this drop-down list to be not shared instead of shared, what that means is that no other user outside of my organization will be able to access this record regardless of whether or not I share data with them in general. So if I don't share, if I do share data with another agency or organization, and I set this to not shared, only users in my org will see it regardless. Okay. Once you finish the demographics form, you hit save, and that's going to take you to the next form in the workflow. The next form in the workflow is a spreadsheet form. Okay. A spreadsheet form allows you to do one of 2 things. It allows you to view data that's already been entered into the database in a way similar to a search form, and it will allow you to create new records in the database somewhat similar to an edit form or like the demographics form we were just on, with one distinction, and that is you can create as many rows as you want. Okay. So I tend to think of this as like just opening up an Excel spreadsheet and creating the column headers that I want, and then just moving down and typing in the data that I want. Okay. So if I'm on this form, I see anybody who is currently in the family. When I create a new client record within Caseworthy, I also create a family and I put that person in the family. The family structure is very, very important for us and for the functionality of our system, as well as for program enrollments and for reporting on HUD required data elements. And so we try to make it as easy as possible to do that. Here on this form, after you see the individual who you've entered, you can click Add Row, and this will add a new row where data can be entered. Again, you want to try to be relatively generic before you check for duplicates, just in case someone spelled something slightly differently than you did, so that you can make sure that this client is not a duplicated record. It is possible to pull in an existing client and add them to a family here, okay? but you want to be sure that that is actually what you want to do before you do so. So for two reasons. One, you want to make sure that the client record you're interacting with is actually right. So if you just happen to see someone who has the same name, you might not necessarily want to add them to the database assuming that they're the same person. And two, having folks in multiple families could result in some difficulties from a compliance standpoint, as an individual might be receiving services from more than one HUD-funded program at the same time at two different locations, which would be problematic from a compliance standpoint. So you really want to be careful about using this, but note that when you check for dupes, it is possible to pull in an existing client record into a family that exists already, okay? Which is sometimes valuable and necessary. In this case, I'm going to say that this is a new client, and I'm going to add another person by the same name because I'm not creative. And in this case, I'm just going to say this data was not collected, and this data was not collected, and that's what I'm going to put for all of these, just for fun. Note that if you indicate on the multi-select for race that the data was not collected, it grays out the other options. Also, if you select any actual race, it grays out the not, doesn't know, refused, and data not collected. So in other words, it's not possible within Caseworthy to indicate that someone both doesn't know and that they have any other race selectable as an option. Okay. When you create family members, you have to identify what the relationship to head of household is. This will technically be done within Caseworthy in two different ways, and that is for purposes of compliance with HUD and for reporting. So that you may have to identify that this person is the head of household, but not necessarily the head of enrollment. All of those are up to you. We just have the options because you report on those two things as different elements at various points for HUD. So in this case, I'm going to say that the individual is a child. Why not? Now, if I needed to add more than one family member to this family as part of this specific intake and enrollment, then it would be really important that I didn't necessarily just hit save here. Because remember, when I hit one of those buttons at the bottom of the form in the bottom right-hand corner, it's going to take me on to the next form. So if I have three different family members to add, and I add one and hit save, then it's going to take me to the next form in the workflow. And remember, I can't go backwards in the workflow directly while I'm in the midst of it because the data is compiling. Okay, so we'll talk about how you can manage those things going forward, but the best way to manage data quality is to train well, is to practice, and is to ensure that, that the appropriate amount of time, especially at the beginning, is taken so that data entry is done right. No one wants to have to update data because that takes more time. And so if we just take a few, especially as we begin to utilize the system more and more and learn how it functions, if we just take a little bit of time to make sure that we do it right the first time, it'll save us a lot of trouble going forward. So I'm going to add another row here. And I'll add another person, breaking my own rules about being specific, just so that we can see how to add multiple. Okay, and you would do that for however many individuals you needed to add to the family as a whole. There is a validation rule that says there cannot be two head of households created using this form, so that's important to note as well. But you can switch them around. Okay. So when I hit save, then I'm going to move on to the next form. The next form in the workflow is the enrollment form. So enrollments in Caseworthy are tied first and foremost to families, and then individual client records are associated with that enrollment after it has been created. This is because of all the people who are in the family, some of them may actually be enrolled in the program for different lengths of time. So this form is actually going to display the family name and it's going to display a project start date and a project end date. Okay, and then there's going to be a drop down that allows us to select from the projects available to users who work at that organization so that we can enroll the family. Okay, so I'm going to pick this one because I know what it is and because I like it and I know what assessments are linked to it. The project start date could technically be backdated. I believe there might be a validation on this form that kind of encourages you not to do that. The end date should, in my opinion, and you're more than welcome to make decisions other than this, but in my opinion, is best left open in every case where you do not know what the client's actual end date will be. In other words, if you don't know when they'll be exited from the program, then it is often best just to leave this exit date set to open. The date that equals open within Caseworthy is 12/31/99/99/99. This is as far into the future as we could possibly go. As I mentioned when I was there on site, we really just honestly don't care past that because we won't be here. But somebody's going to have a problem someday. So I like to leave those open just because it allows us to utilize the system's functionality correctly in terms of actually exiting enrollments and to utilize the workflows that we have built in baseline to make sure that that is done correctly. So that's usually how I like to handle that. Then you pick the program. The provider is the provider responsible for the enrollment. So anywhere you see these question marks in Caseworthy, you can either hover, well, you can hover over them, and every once in a while they may indicate that you can click for more information, and you'll actually get a pop-up that sort of explains things. But here the hover over is just intended to help clarify that the provider selected here will be the client location COC code, which is part of the reason that becomes very important. And we'll see that as soon as we get into the assessments where that's going to pull in again, okay? So this will show any providers associated with the user's current organization. Again, I only have one. If your users are working from multiple locations, in other words, maybe you have more than one office and your users can and do occasionally move from one office to another office in the midst of their regular work week, and those may have more than one provider associated with them, then, or more than one COC code associated with them, then you'll want to make sure your users are aware of how and when they should choose the appropriate provider. Essentially, if they're providing services from one office, then they'll need to make sure that this is associated with that office versus another office. So usually this defaults and most folks don't have to change it, but there are some instances within an HMIS where it can be important. The account dropdown is a baseline field. It is not required, and it is used specifically for identifying accounts to be tied to program enrollments for the purpose of service requests. It is not the equivalent of a funding stream for your program if that funding stream is provided by HUD or some other federal agency, and that agency requires you enter data into HMIS. Instead, when you create the program within Caseworthy, we identify that funding stream. So if it's an ESG program versus an SSVF program versus a RIE program, et cetera, we associate it with that program when we create the program, when we set up the program, as opposed to here. So for the most part, suffice it to say, this field will not be utilized by most of your users, but it will show up baseline. This checkbox here allows me to add a case manager assignment to this program enrollment so that I could indicate that there is a specific user at my organization who is going to be working with this family by virtue of their enrollment in this program. So for the most part, that's going to be something that is done so that for supervisory purposes, but it also has some benefits for the individual to view their caseload and whatnot. It defaults to the current user, but you could change this to any user at your organization. And then you could notify that user theoretically through an email that can be generated through Caseworthy to let that person know. The email itself has a template that loads into it by default, and then it should be able to be sent straight through the system if that is what you would require. I don't know why my template body isn't loading beyond my connection. But so there you go. Pulls in some of the information about the client and about the case manager and about the program and the date, et cetera, and you can just send that off. Put it on my case load. Okay, the other thing you can do is schedule a follow-up. So a follow-up is scheduled for a certain number of days, and it's really just an assignment to a team and or a user, well, and potentially a user, to indicate that they need to follow up with this person after a certain number of days for whatever reason. So this is pretty typically used within an HMIS framework so that we could record recertification dates as necessary. So if it's 30, 60, 90 days, you can change the number of follow-up days here, and it changes the date that's calculated. Follow-up status is probably going to be indicated and left to open so that we can come back to it later and indicate that it's either been scheduled or complete, but usually when you're creating, they're probably going to be open. And then you're going to assign it to any team. This team is going to be filtered based on organization. And so if your organization wants to utilize this functionality, then those teams have to be set up. And then once you do that, you can find individuals who are on that team and assign the follow-up to them. This is a post control. So what this does is basically store the data to be saved when I hit save. So if I click update, there is a little validation that tells me whether or not this is all good to go. If I get the green check mark, that means the data on the form, that is the post control, has been entered correctly, and that it should be good to go in terms of the storing of the data, and that record will be good and stored correctly. If there is some validation on there that indicates that the data is not being stored correctly for whatever reason, then that little checkbox will be yellow, and the form will not let you save until that data is corrected. If you want to get rid of any data in a post control like this follow-up and you click on it again, it goes away, or you can update it based on that edit button that was also there. So as an example, if I want to make changes to it, because perhaps this is yellow, if I click edit, then it opens up what I had already put in. Okay. Again, we have a restriction of shared, not shared at the bottom of this form. When I hit save on the enrollment form, it's going to take me to the enrollment member form. The enrollment member form is going to indicate that which individuals from the family need to be enrolled into the program, as well as the head of household. When I was on the enrollment form and I selected for the family that this is the enrollment, I also automatically enrolled the primary client as the head of household on the enrollment. So when I'm creating the enrollment, if I've gone through the entire workflow and said that this individual is the head of household and I want to enroll this individual's family into the program, that individual is automatically enrolled as the head of that enrollment. Okay. Note that on this specific form, I indicated previously that there is a family member relationship to head of household, and there is an enrollment member relationship to head of household. It is not the case that those two things will necessarily be the same. And so we do not require that you record them in a way that says they are necessarily the same. That said, most of the time they are the same, and changing those around when not necessary could result in data quality problems that you would end up having to troubleshoot as your users end up kind of confused about how the structure of the family actually ought to be. So if you need to think about having the same members enrolled with different relationships to the enrollment, then you can do that, but you just have to make sure that you are entering data accurately and carefully. The start date and end date for any enrollment member, any individual who is being enrolled, must fall within the enrollment begin date and the enrollment end date. In other words, the enrollment begin and end date are the two dates between which every member of the family who is ever enrolled within the program must fit. If we say that the family was enrolled for 2 months, we cannot indicate that the clients were enrolled for 6 months. They have to be somewhat consistent to make sure that the data is nice and clean. Once I've selected the individuals who are going to be enrolled in the program, I can hit save. Now, they don't necessarily all need to be enrolled into the program. In this case, I haven't selected the last record, and I'm not going to enroll that person in the program just as a demonstration. Again, this is also another form where since I have created the head of household enrollment, if I click cancel on this form, then I move forward and only the head of household ends up getting enrolled. Okay. I'm going to enroll these two folks, and then we'll talk about the assessments. There is a single HMIS intake workflow in your database, but there are a number of programs within HMIS that ask various questions about individuals who are being enrolled based on the program itself. We can facilitate this in Caseworthy by using what is called an assessment step. The assessment step on the menu until you get to it in the workflow on the navigation side just is called assessment. Okay, and when we get to that, it passes in the enrollment ID, which can identify the correct program and the correct enrollment members to ensure that whatever assessments are tied to that program are called within the workflow during this step. So I picked the program that I did on purpose because I knew it had multiple assessments linked to it, and we could look at them. So this is the HUD Universal Assessment that's currently being entered for the head of household, which we can tell because the name is here and also the name is here. This blue bar is the assessment manager, because in Caseworthy, an assessment is a combination of a few different things, and it actually is the case for HUD as well, that an assessment is a combination of a client ID and an enrollment ID, so that a specific client who is enrolled in a program gets asked the appropriate assessment questions. It is also a date. So this is the date of the assessment, which is usually defaulted to the date of the program enrollment. And it is an event. An event is a collection event is how HUD describes it. If you've looked at the data dictionary or any of their standards for how this is to be captured. So in 7.2, there are 5 assessment events as defined by HUD. There are at-entry assessment or at-entry collection events, during program collection events, which can be done any number of times while a client is enrolled in a program. So like a recertification process might use the during program assessment collection event to make sure that the data is collected and accurate at recertification. An annual, which is done on an annual basis. An at exit, which is done when the individual is being exited from the program enrollment. And a post exit. Okay, this is a brand new one in 7.2 that you had to include the ability for you to record assessment data after the individual had been exited from the program. So if your program has data elements that need to be captured at that point, then we have to set that up for the program itself when we link the assessments. The HUD Universal Assessment is generally the one that is utilized by Caseworthy to help calculate, based on HUD's definition, whether or not the individual is chronically homeless. So we put in that basic information that ends up being a test. So the first is client location. This is a lookup. This lookup will always load in the provider that is tied to the enrollment. So when we picked the provider location for the enrollment, and the little help text indicated that this is the COC code, helps provide the COC code, that's what happens here. You click on the lookup, it loads that specific location, and then it passes in the COC code to be associated with it, which cannot be edited. Okay. Disabling condition is a yes/no, and we'll talk more about it on the HUD program. And then type of residence indicates what type of place they are currently residing in. Okay, if you select one of the some of these values, will create more questions that have to be answered. So what's the length of stay? What's the date that it started? Regardless of where they stayed last night, how many times have they been homeless? Questions that you should all be familiar with. These are just how they're entered within Caseworthy. And that's the universal. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And included for all household members. The HUD program assessment, which is the next assessment that we'll load, is has a lot of questions on it, and most of the questions that you are used to answering that may be specific to your program are included here and are controlled by validation rules to determine whether or not they're collected for this particular individual during this assessment event. So if HUD requires, based on the funding stream associated with the specific program that I mentioned we set up when we create your program, if HUD requires that certain questions be asked, then those are usually included here. There are some programs that have additional or separate assessments, and we help make sure that those get linked up correctly. But for the most part, a lot of the basic ones, especially questions that might be asked of 2 or more programs, even if not all of them, this is where they end up showing up. So they may show up differently for you based on how your program is set up. If you indicate that they have non-cash benefits, then here's your list, multi-select list of non-cash benefits that they might be receiving so that you can indicate those. The bottom section for the disabling conditions, this is one that has been updated, I know, much to my delight, because a positive answer to any of these used to prompt multiple questions and now has been simplified by HUD to a singular question. If, for whatever reason, the data from the HUD Universal is not consistent with the disabling conditions on the HUD program, there is a post control that appears at the bottom that asks if you want to update the data from the universal. So in other words, if someone says they don't have a disabling condition, and then they come here and say they do have a disabling condition, a little box will pop up and say, do you want to update the disabling condition on the universal assessment? So that you can go back and say, well, the data entry wasn't right there. They are technically separate fields according to the way that they have to be captured to make sure that the chronicity test works correctly in our database. But because of the fact that they might then therefore become incongruent, we give you the option to pick a box that says, oh, I need to go fix that. If that shows up, that always means that your data is not consistent, and so you need to go back and fix it. Just try to fly through this second one more quickly since we just talked about this. Okay, so this is just another example of a HUD-specific assessment for a program. This is a HOPWA assessment. In this case, it's just additional. So again, answering these questions differently may trigger validations that require more information to be entered. All of these are required, so you just have to make sure that they're filled out. So another program-specific assessment. Okay, so the financial assessment within Caseworthy shows the income types that are required to be reported on by HUD. This is a spreadsheet form. So the information at the top will be associated with these multiple records at the bottom. So you choose the area median income for which it should be compared, and then you indicate whether or not they have income at any source. If the answer to this is yes, then you must select one of these boxes in order to proceed. If you try to proceed without doing so, you get an error message that says, if you say they have income, then you have to say which kind of income they have. If you say that they do not have income, then the save button changes to a save no income, which allows you to run a procedure that basically says they have no income whatsoever. That allows you, in other words, to avoid having to say yes, they have income and they have zero earned income, because they don't, right? So that's how that functions. The intervals have some nice parenthetical descriptive text to help you understand how they are calculated. But no matter how you decide to put this information in, that, for instance, they get paid $50 every 2 weeks, it calculates to a monthly amount. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that it calculates for monthly, by 2, because some months have 5 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. So it pulls it out based on an average and gets that monthly amount, which is what HUD requires for the income. There was some question as well, as we've talked through this, as we were putting it together, about whether or not information for children should be recorded on the child's record. I would strongly recommend that you always enter data accurately based on the situation as it exists in the real world, so that if, in this case, the child has some sort of Social Security income or child support or whatever that goes directly and is specifically dedicated for the individual, that is where that information is stored. Some of the reports that require financial information, specifically that look for the total information for adults in the household, we factor that in when we think about the reporting. So again, I would just strongly recommend that you do the data entry accurately in terms of what the actual scenario is. In other words, don't try to, unless you determine that there is a reason to do so, I would not necessarily recommend moving one person's income to another person's record for the sake of some sort of compliance that I'm not aware of. So that's what I would really focus on if I were you. Okay, and then the last usual HUD assessment that you'll see in a lot of programs is the health insurance. For this particular program that I like to test with, it is set up as a HOPL program, which means that if the individual says no to the health insurance type, they have to provide a reason why. Most other programs do not require this reason why, which means that you'll just see all of these together and they'll all default to no. These do require that you have some answer entered. So for most programs, aside from HOPL, which requires further data collection, it's very nice to note that if they have only one source of health insurance, you really only have to toggle one drop-down list. If they have none, then you just have to hit save and the data will be stored correctly. But again, for this particular program, I have to either say yes or indicate why. And in this case, it's an assessment that has to be filled out for every client member. So I'm just going to very quickly pick some answers to help satisfy these requirements. Okay, and once I finish that, then I'll hit save. Okay, the next form in this HMIS intake workflow is intended specifically for agencies and providers that have a very specific shelter purpose, so that the individual could be placed into a bed. So this is a suggested reservation form. What it does is it looks at the enrollment provider, the location at which the individual is enrolled in the program, and notes that if they have any resource usages or housing slots, essentially, that the individual could be reserved and then checked in to that specific that specific slot, bed slot. We've talked about this. We talked about it at length when I was up there, and I think we'll probably end up doing. I think Helen will coordinate with me to help provide some additional training on it, as it is sort of its own fairly comprehensive piece of functionality. And in the sake of time, I'm going to sort of not dive too deeply into it at this exact moment, but needless to say, if you are checking folks into rooms and or beds, that the suggested reservation form within the workflow is a way to take the specific individual client with whom you are working and enroll them into a shelter bed. So I click done, and it's going to take me to the service spreadsheet. The service spreadsheet has a drop-down for programs. So I'm going to pick the program that I just enrolled my client in. And once I pick that program, I'll hit search. And the results are going to show me all services associated with that program that can be provided to that client on an ongoing basis. So if I'm providing last month's rent, for instance, I can indicate the date that was provided. Number of units, essentially, depending on the service, oftentimes in a situation like last month's rent, it may also be the equivalent of number of services provided, essentially. So we provided rent for 1 month, in the amount of $100. Oops. Then my service total value would be equal to $100. But we might have done 2 months rent at $100 so that my service total ends up being $200. Whatever is going to end up getting you the data that you desire to report on most accurately can be done, but there is always a unit, a value for those units, a unit of measure, which could be changed by the user as they enter the data, and then a total. The account, again, is not going to be utilized more than likely because you're not utilizing that functionality. And in the event that a specific agency determines that they ought to make their recording of service types more clear, they may elect to add a long description to the service during the setup, which would display here. So the purpose of this originally added to your specific database was to be able to help reduce the number of services for each program to a manageable number, and to indicate in the long description that you may have previously seen that service listed as by another name, and that it should be associated it should be recorded under this name within the new HMIS database. So once I have selected that service and filled in the appropriate information, then I click Save. And that service has now been recorded on the client's record as part of my intake process. The last form in the workflow is just a case note summary form, which would let you see any case notes that were currently recorded on the client's record, or add a new case note just by clicking on the Add New button, filling out the required fields, and writing in the case note itself, and then hitting Save. Okay. There are some other options on the case note form as a whole, but I'll probably defer on those for now as well for the sake of time, because I'm already running behind. Clicking done here brings me to the end of my workflow. So this form that displays now is just a summary of all the things that I did and when I did them. This becomes especially handy when the workflow may be completed over the course of time. And so you can go back and see when each of the specific data elements may have been captured and recorded, or when each of the forms was completed for that specific intake. When I click done here, then it's going to take me back to the client dashboard for the individual that I was just working with. Okay, the head of household specifically. Once here, we went ahead and added links to the dashboard itself, so that you could go back and edit any of the information within the workflow. Okay, so if the client's demographic information was entered wrong and saved, since I cannot go backwards in the workflow, in the midst of that workflow, I can come into the demographics form here and review and update and change any data that I might need to. Let's say the date of birth was off just slightly. And once I hit save, oops, that shouldn't have happened again. Then the client has a new birthday, so we can update the data that way. Okay. Similarly, the family members, if I forgot to add a family member, that is specifically what this is for. If I forgot to add a family member and I need to go back and add another row, then I can add that other row with this spreadsheet form. Family management as a whole does have some nuances, and so we've talked about it in training, and I think we'll probably follow up with it more as time goes on. But this is specifically intended for, oops, I hit save before I added all the family members. I need to go back and add another family member. That's the form that's there. The project enrollment form here is the enrollment member summary form. So this form did not appear within the workflow, but it shows you the enrollment information as it was recorded during the enrollment itself. It would allow you to add a new enrollment, which would take you to the form that is present within the workflow. Or you could click on the action wheel and edit certain elements of the enrollment information, review the enrollment members, so the individuals who had been added to the enrollment and the records that we saw during the workflow. This form also then has the link to the enrollment status, which on the link includes the ability to complete exit assessments, annual assessments, during program assessments, or to simply view the assessments. When you click on the View Assessment button, there is a pop-up that displays, and it shows you any assessment event and member associated with that program enrollment, and gives you the opportunity to select one and view their assessments in a single pop-up that shows all of the assessment information that was collected. So you can see all of the assessments at once. The other thing that's important about this form is that some HUD programs do require a one-time data element to be captured during the course of program enrollment. And if that is the case, there will be a button here that displays on one-time fields and allows you to enter things such as move-in date after the fact. Okay. I'm going to click done. There was a question, I think, Helen, I think you tried to respond, but I think you ended up sending that directly just to me, asking whether or not this is being recorded, and yes, it is. The next link over on the dashboard is going to show case manager assignments. So during the workflow, if we had created associated an individual to serve as the case manager with the client's enrollment, then that is visible here. Again, the action wheel on this form would allow us to edit that record to make any changes and updates that might need to be made. So if I click on edit, then it'll let me basically change the begin and end date and who the individual is. I can also technically change the client by finding other clients who should be associated with it. But in general, it's pretty basic in terms of what we can update. Okay, I'm gonna use my breadcrumbs and go back one. The link to HUD assessments will take you to the dashboard where all HUD assessments live, essentially, and that will allow you to update any data that might have been entered. So we have a link to each of the HUD required assessments on this dashboard, and if the individual has any assessment data on those specific assessment forms, we have a query that shows that. So if you wanted to go and view the assessment data, you could either go through the button link for the HUD Universal, for instance, or you could click on this HUD Universal assessment row here, which would also take you to the HUD Universal summary form for that individual client, which would then allow you to click on the action wheel again and update any data that may have been entered incorrectly. And then to save the new record or the updated record. Okay. The KC-HMIS assessments is a dashboard that is similar to the HUD assessments dashboard, but it is for assessments that are unique to your community, and specifically those that are going to be tied to the coordinated access, coordinated entry process. So there's some specific thoughts about how that's going to function and who's going to have access to that, and et cetera, and that conversation is still happening. But suffice it to say, if any of that assessment data had been entered as part of the program enrollment, then you could update that data here. Housing reservations is a form that will show you any reservations that the individual has in either a housing or a classroom or an event. Currently, this client does not have any, so nothing displays here. But this is the form where all of those, well, the dashboard where all of those things can be viewed as a single sort of landing pad for all that kind of information. Each of these specific forms would show you specific reservations and check-ins for the individual, and if they were checked into or reserved for any coordinated assessment beds. Again, we'll probably end up going over all of that functionality a different day. The services summary form is just going to show you a list of services provided to the client. So this is the place where you can go back and review the service provided in the midst of the workflow that I added when I indicated we did some last month's rent for the client. So handy, nice little summary form. This does have an edit button, although it is often the case that editing a service has fewer options than originally creating it, or at least they look somewhat different. But it is the same functionality in terms of unit value and the quantity and the unit of measure to get you that unit total. We have the case note summary form again, which is the same that we saw in the workflow. Allows you to view any case note on the client's record, and also then to add a new record if you would like to do so. So a new case note, again, which has some required fields, the ability to pull in a template, which has a summary and can include some of the client's information, and then you can just save that quantitative data as a case note. And the last link here is actually a documents link that was requested while we were on site doing a super user training. It's not currently incorporated in any of the workflows, but this just allows you to add new uploaded documents to the client's record, which may be something that is described more fully in the future and in subsequent training. But again, the emphasis at this point, up to this point, has been to try to focus on the intake process itself. Okay, once my client is enrolled and I've been able to verify all of the appropriate components, maybe make any updates that need to be made, back on that project enrollment form, just so you're aware of how the process I mentioned earlier is built to function. The best way to exit a client and a family from a program is to select the enrollment status and then complete the exit assessment. So this will trigger a new workflow. This workflow includes an assessment step so that we can update any data that needs to be captured at program exit for reporting purposes, and pass that along. Within the application, we do allow you the opportunity to copy assessment data. So if I were to select yes in this question, it would let me pick the individuals who are being pulled into this assessment step. I'm going to select both of them, and then look up a specific assessment event. So I click on that lookup for this first client. I have a date, a program name, and an assessment type. So I click on the little dot and then hit select. Radio button, that's what that's called. And I'm going to do it for both clients. So I just did the same thing for both clients, just looking up those previous assessments that we just did. Copy those assessments, which sometimes takes just a second, and then recognition that it has been done successfully. In this case, there's nothing actually required here for this specific program on this form, so it just looks like it's blank. The HUD program assessment will have a lot of the same questions at exit, but it'll have some new questions, right? So where are they headed? What's their housing disposition? And then it allows you to review the data. One note about copied assessments is that this is not the same assessment information that was entered previously. It is exactly copied. In other words, changing this data here does not change the data at entry. It just gives you the opportunity to do more efficient data entry by assuming that their entry information or their most recent assessment information is likely to be at least partially correct. So then you can select which of these things may or may not be true at this point as opposed to at the most recent assessment. And this is the case all the way through. I'm just going to kind of fly through these assessments since we just walked through them. Okay, this last form in the workflow is basically just going to confirm that this family is going to be exited from this program. This will be the end date for the program enrollment. And this is the an optional checkbox to also put an end date on the case manager assignment so I don't have to go back and update that additionally. This just lets me say, hey, I'm going to exit that case assignment as well. So I'm going to check that and then hit save. And then here's my summary. And now if I go back to the project enrollment, I would be able to see that they are now exited from the program. Okay, so that is the intake workflow and updating data entered within it. Do you have any specific questions? I think next we're kind of set to spend the next bit of time focusing on reports. So before we launch into that and sort of switch topics, I'd be curious to know if you have any specific questions about those things. Helen, do you want to try to help field those or facilitate some of those questions?
Yes, I'll definitely do that. So go ahead if you have questions, either unmute yourself or type it into chat. We'll also have another opportunity at the end for questions as well. So Matt, why don't you go ahead and get started, and then if there are questions that come up along the way, go ahead and enter them into chat and then we can get them answered. Valerie's asking for a 5 to 7 minute break before launching into reports. Let's go 5 minutes since we're already running a little bit behind.
5 minutes. I'll pause the recording while we do that too.
Awesome, thanks. Matt. Okay, let's dive into reporting, please.
Okay, so Caseworthy has 2 sections of reports that are fairly specific for various purposes that we're going to talk about today. So the first one I'm going to talk about is actually operational reports, and then we'll talk about compliance reports. So under the administration tab in the case manager role, and then reporting, there's a link, there are several links, but I'm going to focus on 2 in the next few minutes. Operational reports is a dashboard. This little icon here indicates that these are dashboards, and the dashboards are going to take you to places with lots of menus. Okay, this is, hold on a second. We upgraded you, and this did not get updated to the 7.0 reports. So there are a bunch more operational reports in 7.0 than you would have seen in 6.2. So I just replaced that dashboard in the case manager role. So if you're not seeing all these reports and you're, again, following along at home, you may need to re-select reporting and then operational reports and reload that dashboard, and you should see more. So in version 7.0 and above, we ended up changing a lot of the way the service reports in particular function. But all the reports on this dashboard are intended to be general operational reports. In other words, they provide information and a reporting framework for simple transactions, relatively simple transactions that are baseline within Caseworthy's functionality and that are frequently kind of asked questions. Specifically, that would include program enrollments. So all the program reports up here are really focused on program enrollments as a general rule. And then services. So services provided. So some of these reports will actually just be search forms. So the clients and programs, for instance, if I click on that, takes me to a search form that allows me to search by program. So if I click on this multi-select, there's going to be a lot of options that come up. I'm going to add my testing that I've been using. By a specific provider, if I would like. By a specific enrollment status, so that I could see who was pending assessment, enrolled, or exited. We're currently not in your database really utilizing the unknown or ineligible, but if they were pending, enrolled, or exited as of this date. And then I could click search and see the information that matches those characteristics. So these are folks that are enrolled within this program of some kind or had an enrollment within a certain date range. Generally speaking, it's going to look for anybody that is openly enrolled or where the enrollment is covered by today. So if they were enrolled previous and have been exited since then they won't show up. But if they were exited this day, then they may show up. And then there's our statuses for all of those. This may be a really handy report for those of you who are like supervisors to look at who has assessments pending within a specific program so that you could follow up with folks to figure out why the assessments weren't completed, because the assessments are where a good chunk of the important reportable data for HUD is being captured. Clients exited from programs, as an example, is another search form, and it allows you to look for basically anybody who has been exited based on that status, and then you could focus on a specific program if you'd like. Okay, we do have the ability to auto-exit clients from programs, and so that's what this is telling us, is that these folks were all set up to be exited from the program automatically, more than likely based on these records here, after 90 days. The usefulness of many of these operational reports you will discover essentially as you use them. I can tell you what they are designed to do, but for the most part, these are, since they are basic reports, I have folks that use them in a variety of ways depending on what it is that they want to know. So that's something that you might just get in and tweak, because these are going to be things, generally speaking, that are not going to load into HUD compliance reports, but that you may be curious to know for other reasons, for supervisory reasons, making sure that your folks are enrolling people, completing the assessments, et cetera, just because folks may ask you certain questions about how your agency is doing with regards to program enrollments and service provision, et cetera, because you're accountable to more than just HUD, and so some of these reports may be useful in that regard. This third one over is a nice search form as well. That's going to show you family members missing from existing enrollments in that program, so that if there are folks, if there are client records who are members of a specific family that were left off the enrollment, you can see that individual. So like this is the one that I was working on, where I intentionally left off one member, and you can see, hey, that person was left off. That may or may not be the appropriate way to enter the data, but it is nice to at least be able to view that, right? So maybe this individual should have been left off, and maybe they should not have, but it lets you review that as well. Again, folks use that for a variety of purposes depending on what their needs are. So those are all search form reports. We also have analytics reports. So in case where the analytics are pivot tables, essentially, that allow you to do some manipulation of the data on the fly. So if I click search on this particular analytic, it's going to load the analytic. So this is based on a specific sort of value, and it functions just as any other pivot table. So there's your sum of days enrolled. I'm not sure why it would be set up exactly like this. I may not do it just like this, but you can move these pretty much on the fly. So that you could maybe move those up and then click OK. And it'll reload that. So you can see the sum of days enrolled, which is kind of nice, and then expand that to get more information potentially. So they end up getting tweaked and played with a lot because you have the ability to do that. But analytics in general, there's another section of the system that focuses specifically on analytics as well. Can be a really nice little feature to be able to sort of modify things, move them around, rearrange them however it might be most useful for you with regard to getting the data back out of the system. Okay. A third kind of report that we have within Caseworthy is the SSRS report. So if I click on this program summary and provide a begin date, which I'll just do this, and an end date, and I can filter by organization, and potentially program if I'd like. Can be all, none, or some. And run this report. The SSRS report is going to come up in a new window. And the viewer is going to have some nice detail. Logo is included here. It gives you information about how you ran the report, what parameters you provided, and then sort of a nice pie chart that shows you the top 10 programs by distinct client, a distinct count of clients within that program associated with that organization, And then you can even do a drill down by clicking on these numbers in order to see who those specific unique individuals are. Then this back button will go back to the parent report, so that lets you go back to the summary report, as it's sometimes referred to. Sometimes these program summary reports might be multiple pages, so there's a next page button here. And once you are satisfied with it, you can actually export it into a variety of formats. Word will just open it in sort of a visual version of itself in a Word document. Excel will open it in Excel, but it will make it, it'll try to maintain the visual appearance of the report, which can sometimes be actually more complicated if you really want to try to take like the data from a sub-report and start manipulating it or analyzing it or digging into it really deeply, in which case the CSV is actually probably a better option for you. The main difference being that the CSV just drops all the formatting. And so the columns, you don't have to worry about merged columns and all these kinds of things that can cause problems. You can also just export it into a number of other visual representations, such as PowerPoint, PDF, TIFF. XML is actually going to be like a web code file. It's probably pretty difficult to read, so you're probably not going to utilize that all that often, but you can just kind of as a point of reference get it out pretty easily in this way. And so that it comes out, in a nice PDF that you can view. Okay, so those are basically the three primary kinds of reports that we have in this section of operational reports. So it's going to be the summary search forms, analytics, or SSRS reports. Some of the newer 7.0 reports or 7.0 and above reports do have some fuller options. So when you're looking at clients served in particular for 7.0, there's a begin date and an end date. And then there are a huge number of options that can be selected. And then you can group by another set of options. So we could group by program, for instance. And then the number one thing that we added in 7.0 and above that is different is this group by like units, because services might have different units. And so this allows us to tie those, to sort of lump those together, so that if we run this report, this is also showing you the new look and feel that we're working on, because this is technically a QA site. So 7.2 prod sites, I don't think have this all the way implemented yet, but since we're in a 7.2 QA site, as we continue the testing before your go live, this is what the new reports look like. They're actually in the process of being redesigned visually. So here's the specific program, and then the services by program. That doesn't really give us a good sense of how the group by is working, because there's not a whole lot going on, but services by program, and then we can drill down into those services by program. See who those individuals that receive those services are and expand those so we can see more information about those services, et cetera, et cetera. See if there's one that has multiple. Nope, by dollar. Yeah. This bottom gray line is where the services would be grouped. So if we had multiple services of different units, they would be separated by different gray bars, and then we'd have the yellow organization total at the bottom. Okay, so those are our SSRS reports. We have a number of those for services. I would really focus on the 7.0s for you. They're going to include that group by functionality, which is new. First time served is a report that requires that the user has set up different different master providers that tie all the providers together, and you guys are currently not utilizing that. It's done for specific kinds of functionality for a very specific group of customers that we have. And so that first time serve report isn't actually going to do a whole lot for you right now, but any of the others you're more than welcome to test out. We do have reports on users, so like follow-ups and caseloads and logins. So those are all reports that let you see how those are being entered within the system if you would like. Most of the other reports that you have down here currently are not going to necessarily apply to you. We're not currently doing goals within your system. We're definitely not doing these financial reports because you don't have any service request functionality that's doing that through accounts. The project management is really for customers who are using the system to track time and energy spent for supporting other individuals or customers actually specifically. So it's a project management module that's sort of continually being built out. And then placement reports are for primarily employment and retention records that are utilized by Goodwills. So those aren't necessarily something that you'll use either. But again, these first three sections of operational reports could be really, really handy and helpful for you. Okay. Okay, compliance reports. There's a whole section, a whole host of compliance reports. This is the most recent version of it, and it has even our historical compliance reports for HUD, as well as the newest, latest and greatest that are required. Right now in this database, there is not a whole lot of real reportable data. So most of these reports are not going to pull 100% correctly. Additionally, I believe Mark is working with and will continue to work with you to make sure that all the data that is entered within your HMIS is mapped correctly to these reports, because some of them do require mapping. We have, again, provided numerous documents that detail how each report is supposed to be set up and utilized. And so that's how we'll help make sure that gets done. But there are some reports that I'll just kind of point out, and if you have any specific questions about them, we can talk about them, but at this point we won't see a huge amount. Just know that when HUD sends us the data elements, they also send us how they have to be reported out upon, and that is the logic that is utilized to create these reports. Okay, so we don't just take our best guess. HUD gives us the specs. They provide to all HMIS vendors the technical specifications for both data entry and for reporting. And we work to match those specs based on HUD's requirements. And I think our product management and reporting team do a pretty good job of that. And they continue to work with HUD on an ongoing basis. So we are maintaining our compliance with those reports to the best of our ability based on the information provided to us by HUD. So at this point, we have reports such as the SAGE APR, which is the newest one, or one of the newest ones that I'm aware of. It has two components, as do almost all the APRs, which would allow us to, let me just pick one just for the sake of the example. Most of the APRs are required to be updated or submitted via CSV format. And so we give you the option to both export to CSV, but also to review the report information itself. So there are two buttons down here. The export button is going to generate a export file that's queued up, and I'll show you where that's accessible in just a few minutes. But also then to view the report itself as an SSRS report. When we are providing a report for CSV, then we oftentimes will let you see the information that's going to be sent in. So these are the specific pieces about how you sent information into the report through the launch form, and then more specific detailed information about the information that's going to be included within the report based on what's in your database. Again, right now, there's not a whole lot of actual real reportable data. So I'm not surprised to see that a lot of these aren't necessarily coming out with real numbers, but we'll be working with you after go live to make sure that that is correct. The other thing that we do anytime there's going to end up being a CSV export is we always give you a link somewhere towards the top for a client detail subreport. So clicking on this link will take you to a subreport of all clients included on the report and all the data elements that might be included with that report so that you can identify any elements that might be missing or inaccurate and go quickly update those fields. In other words, so you don't have to dig through numerous records from the case management perspective to identify the folks who ought to be have their data updated, and you can go and sort of review each record. It is long because there are a lot of data elements, but it is exportable to a CSV, right, which would let you manipulate it and work through it more quickly, I would think. So for all of these reports, we're going to try to include that data quality subreport. This particular one is like 12 pages. So again, it's just giving you a chance to see all the things that are being included in the CSV. So just as an example. Part of the trickiest part at this point with all the baseline reports we have is just making sure that you pick all the right, the right year, the right version of the report, but we can help clean that up if it's too burdensome and confusing. So for instance, there are several ESG capers which have since been updated. The caper itself is also going to have a CSV, right? So it's the same kind of thing and a report so that it can be done and you can dig into the data quality on that one as well. So again, you just put in a begin date. Let's just put one in for fun. And an end date. I know there's lots of excitement to see some of these, so I'll just see what I can pull. So again, here's a lot of the information that's being included. There's links to a variety of different sections. So there's Q9A and Q9B because it may not fit the same format. So again, all the data is being included and reviewed here. There's not a whole lot of data coming in because we don't have much. And then we've got that detail subreport. With all the data elements. Again, if HUD has a specific requirement for the report that we have to be able to provide, then we are providing it. So there's all sorts of program-specific reports that you can pull out of here, including the CSV export, and the 2017 path, HIC, et cetera, system-wide performance measures. But again, without good data, these are, I can pull any of these just to kind of show you. The system-wide performance measures takes a little bit more setup, so let me show that very briefly, just because it requires that you create a report ID The report ID has a number of different things that may or may not be tied to it, so including a name, a start date and an end date, the COC codes that should be included, any organizations and projects that should be included. So there's a decent amount of setup that's done just to sort of create this structure for the report itself. I won't create a new one because I've got a couple already. But once that's created, it creates a line just like this one. And then on the action wheel, you refresh the warehouse. So you pretty much just go through the steps. You create the report itself, and then you're going to set up the report options, which is just an opportunity to view or edit or update what was done initially. So for instance, I'm going to actually expand the date range on this. Once that's done, then you're going to refresh the HUD warehouse, which is just essentially it'll show you the times that it's been done. And so you just refresh it. It's only as often as necessary because it can take some time. Right now, the database isn't very large, so it's not going to be huge. There are some descriptive page text at the top that kind of gives some sense of what this is being used for. But the bigger the database gets, the longer that will take. And then you can generate the performance measures. This is essentially just going to be a stored procedure. You're going to run it. It's going to tell you that it's being run. The page is going to refresh and tell you that it was last refreshed then. And then you click done, and it takes you back. Shouldn't be showing up twice, but it does. And then once you've done all that, you can read the performance measures. Again, as a report with a drill down, that's going to give you all the fields that get included ever in a 6-page printout. These menu options here, they're kind of difficult to see. I think they'll be a different color in the newer format, but these are the drill downs at the top. So you can get into, here's all the data elements that are going into each section of the report and the folks that are included. And once you're satisfied with that, then you can generate the CSV that's going to go to HUD. So when you do that, it just says, hey, we're creating the CSV, and it'll be available to download in your area in a certain amount of time. Okay, so currently I don't have that menued up in the case manager role, but I'll show you under the system admin role by switching to that, and we can copy things over from role to role. That's not a problem. But in the system admin section of the system admin role, and then the administration menu, there are batch file exports. And these batch file exports would include any of those files we were just looking at, so that when you get to the point where you need to come and download that performance measures, there'll be a file name if it's ready, and you can download the specific file here in a zip format, so that for most of the HUD uploads, usually they'll accept a zip format because it'll be a whole bunch of different spreadsheets. If not, maybe they make you upload them one at a time. They kind of change how they approach it from over time. But this gets you all the files you need to upload directly to HUD based on the data that's in the system. So those are how the major compliance reports are going to work when they have to be exported. They'll give you that option for reviewing the data from a data quality perspective, and then update it as you need, and then export it to that CSV so you can send it on to HUD. Okay, again, there's a lot of them, but there's not a lot of data. I could drill into a bunch of them, but the functionality is all going to be the same for almost all of them. This by name list is a baseline version of the by name list that we have been working on that is specifically built upon and predicated upon the utilization of the VI SPDAT. So since that's not being used in your community, this report currently is not going to do the things that are needed, but we are working on by name list for you. We just got some more information about it today, so hopefully that'll be something we can get over to you soon, so you can use an automated by name list through Caseworthy. We also have the SSVF and HOPWA reports that are required for reporting purposes to the VA and other sources. So those are here as well, similar to these HMIS HUD compliance reports. The SSVF is basically the same kind of structure where you can run a cover sheet report that'll show you what your data quality is and has a drill down as well, and then generate that export that has to be uploaded to the repository. Okay, there's VI SPDAT reports. These reports are specific to Goodwills and Catholic Charities, so that's probably not something you need to worry about. If you are going to try to use the Catholic Charities USA report out of Caseworthy, it does require a fairly substantial amount of setup because of the way that that report is structured. It would essentially, to be most useful, would require that all your reportable programs are included within Caseworthy and that the data is being tracked consistently through our application. CSBG, Roma, and LIHEAP, all these are for essentially weatherization or EA. So these may become useful at some point. We do have them. The CSBG and the Roma are both being updated because they have shipped out new requirements, but we have those as well. If you are a shelter or emergency shelter, you may find that this daily meal count and attendance report can be useful. It just is going to give an accounting basically of the services provided in that regard. And then the data quality stuff down here is really good. The new data quality report for fall in particular, we spent a lot of time on that. So that can be a good report to run to view how the data looks for a specific program or organization. So let's look at that one. This is again just an SSRS report. In this case, it's not going to have any CSV output because that's not the intended purpose of this, but it will just give you some data quality reports on various different elements and the error rates included. And then, for instance, with the personally identifiable information, these are all, again, drill downs that are going to show you the client ID, and the individual, and then go through and kind of indicate to you what the status is of the data element. So note that like this client has all ones. And so we ended up saying there's potentially data issues because that's not really a valid social. Information missing, right? So there's lots of feedback about what the specific element is, and if there are issues, what those issues are, to kind of help you troubleshoot data quality issues that you might encounter throughout the system. Okay, and then these are housing counseling reports that are only specific and will be utilized if you decide to implement the HUD housing counseling vertical within Caseworthy, which we have. So if you have a grant with HUD or a sub-grant for that specific program, we can help get you set up and utilize that as well, in addition to utilizing it for HMIS. But that'll be something that'll come down the pipe. Okay, do you have any specific questions about reporting, or anything else?
If anyone has any questions, go ahead and enter them into chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Oh, Amy has a question. Are the COC level reports only open to COC to pull, such as system performance measures?
Not baseline, but Mark is going to be working with you and with us to define how these forms should be accessible by role so that they can be configured to determine who should have access to what reports. As of this time, those requirements have not been fully articulated to us, but it's not going to be a huge project or undertaking to do once we actually have the specific requirements for how the reports should be accessed. So right now they're not, but they can be configured to be that way.
And Amy had another question, and I'm assuming specific agencies don't have the ability to pull reports for any other agencies besides their own, correct?
Again, all those requirements have to be articulated, and then we can configure it. Baseline Caseworthy doesn't know who's going to belong to what org and what orgs are going to share to one another. So we don't have any forms, built as part of the out-of-the-box application that are going to accommodate those needs. Those are going to have to be articulated, defined, required, communicated to us, preferably in writing, and we'll help get them in place.
Yep, I've got that on my list to do. So I'll be doing that today.
I'm just going to show how to upload documents. Do you think that's, yeah, can do that.
Yes. Are there any other additional reporting questions, or any questions at all for that matter? Okay. Marlene, I wanted to introduce Jeff as well. He's joined our team, Jeff Monig, and you will see him probably, and he will come visit you and conduct training, and he'll also be here for support purposes as well. So I wanted to introduce him to you. And also, Matt, if it's okay with you, could we spend a little bit of time talking about document upload? I think you touched on it a little bit in terms of how agencies can go in and upload documents for clients and attach it to the client record.
Sure.
Is that something we should talk about right now? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a really straightforward process in Caseworthy. So if I go back to the case manager role, as long as I'm on the right client record, any documents I upload via this link here on the client dashboard are going to be tied to that client record, right? So if I just click on the documents dashboard, then I have a few options. Specifically, this is also where we might capture or view any pictures, so that the picture in this corner could be updated or associated with that specific individual. We have a number of options, but the nicest one, as far as I'm concerned, is the document check. The document check is a form. So if I just click on document check, it's a summary form with an add new. That's going to let you not only upload a file, but it's going to let you record data about that file. So the file is going to be included into the application so that it's visible, accessible by folks who have access to the client's record. But it's also going to let me record some stuff about it. So if I click Add New here, there are a number of document types that can all be associated with a category. So like Social Security card, for instance. Can be associated with the client's record, and we can identify what is the verification method. So again, this is where we're recording really data about the upload itself. This is what we're uploading. This is what we're going to upload. This is how we're recording the data about it. So I got a copy of it. I scanned it. I saw it, right? It was visual, et cetera, et cetera. It was missing. If it's missing, a lot of the options go away because we don't have it. But we do get a description text box. So each of these list options might have some slightly different implications for how that data is going to be entered. But the assumption is, for instance, like a scanned file is really probably the option you're most likely to choose if the client brings something to you and you scan it and you're going to upload it into Caseworthy. Okay. We give it a created date, which is just going to be essentially the date that it was uploaded. So it's just like an upload date. And then you can give it an expiration date. So you can say, hey, this needs to be looked back upon and reviewed again in a year. So this is good for a year. Okay. And we can, there's two options for uploading images. Most of the time, folks are going to be working on pulling files from their computer instead of working with a scanning device. that will essentially hold the document while being connected to your computer and then moving it directly to Caseworthy. So the browse option is probably going to be the most likely utilized. So all you have to do is click browse. And then as an example, let's go to this one, which is just the document I have. We're going to upload that, and then we can indicate where it's being uploaded. Well, if we're saying it's scanned, then the system's going to default that to be electronic file, because that's the assumption is if you're scanning it, then you're going to include it in their electronic file. So you just click browse, you say where it's going to go, and you hit save. And then this form will reload, and you've got that record. Here's the one that I created. This is where I'm storing it. This is what kind of file it is. This is the date that it expires. And then I can click View File and open it up straight from the application. Test document. See how clever this one is? So very, very, very easy. You can upload as many as you want. We do, I believe, in our contracts, we indicate that there's a certain amount of space. I have not seen anybody actually get to a point where they've run out of space to upload documents. And I came from an agency that was doing it a lot. So I would say, you know, that's something you should probably take advantage of, especially for paper documentation. When it gets into the, you know, I don't know that I would upload like movies, because then you're going to run out of space. But for paper documentation, this is really, really, really great resource to put all sorts of things on the client's record. Copies of leases, copies of landlord's W-9s, copies of identification, copies of whatever it is that you want. And we can help configure the list of options that you'll see when you go to add the new, based on either both category. So you can filter this by category or just by whatever it is you want to see in this list. So very, very straightforward, very, very easy. You just pick the type, you upload the document, and you hit save.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions about anything? We have a little bit of time, so if you want Matt to review any other aspects of the intake or the client, you know, editing any aspect of the client record, or reporting, then let us know. If there's an area that's a little bit fuzzy, we're happy to review it with you. Okay. Oh, there's a question. Okay. For those document uploads, are those available for anyone to see across all agencies? That's a good question.
Currently, yes. But again, that could be configured.
So I guess that means then that would be sort of an agency by agency decision, right? Mm-hmm. To determine if the client comes in, whether or not those document uploads are shareable. Because it doesn't look like, at least on that portion of whatever can be uploaded, there's the ability to share or not share, right?
There is a restriction, yes. So as you're uploading the document, you could indicate that you want it not shared with others.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Amy, does that answer your question? So when they are going through the upload process, then they have the ability to share or set the restriction based on each document. Yeah. So for each document, you have the ability to set that restriction to shared or not shared.
That is correct. Yep.
Any other questions? And if there are questions, and so we leave the training today and you start thinking about things and there are questions post-training, then feel free to reach out to me and I can try to answer those questions. And if I can't, after I do some research, then I'll pass those along to Matt. Jeff will also be available as soon as he gets up to speed to answer questions as well.
I'll provide the link to Mark, and then Mark will distribute the video.
Great. So we'll be recorded. I'll make sure to distribute the video. There may be some people I don't have their email addresses. So if you could send me a note with your email address. I'm hkrosky, Krosky @mark.org. If you're still on. I'll put it in chat as well. I can get it figured out to send to everybody. If nobody else has any questions, then we'll call it a day.
Alrighty.
Thanks so much, everyone, for attending. Thanks so much, Matt, for presenting.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
No problem.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.